Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where winter isn't just a chill in the air. It's a force that grips your bones, turns your breath to frost, and tests every fiber of your being. You're standing in a vast, snow-covered field, the wind howling like a living thing, carrying the threat of predators and the weight of an endless night. This was the reality of the medieval shepherd, a man whose life was a quiet but fierce battle against the elements. A figure history often overlooks but whose story pulses with raw, unshakable resilience. Welcome to Boring History, where we dust off the forgotten corners of the past and bring them to life. Today, we're stepping into the frozen world of the medieval shepherd, a man who faced winter's wrath with nothing but his wits, his courage, and a stubborn will to survive. So, grab a warm drink, settle in, and let's walk through the snow alongside him. Picture a young man, maybe barely out of his teens, standing at the edge of a village as dawn breaks over a frostbitten landscape. His name might be lost to time, but his role was vital. He was a shepherd, tasked with guarding the livestock that meant survival for his community. In the Middle Ages, when agriculture and animal husbandry were the heartbeat of society, a flock wasn't just animals, it was food, clothing, and the difference between prosperity and ruin. Lose a single sheep, and a family might go hungry. Lose a herd, and a village could face starvation. The shepherd carried this weight on his shoulders, day after day, through scorching summers and brutal winters. His life was one of constant motion, a nomadic dance across fields and hills, following the best pastures for his flock. He had no permanent home, no warm hearth to return to. Instead, he slept under the stars, in makeshift shelters of branches and sod, his world defined by the rhythms of nature. His tools were simple but purposeful. A staff worn smooth by years of use wasn't just for herding. It was a weapon against wolves, a probe for icy paths, a crutch when exhaustion set in. A whistle, carved from wood or bone, carried his commands across valleys, guiding his flock or signaling danger. A knife, its blade curved and sharp, was his constant companion, used for everything from cutting firewood to mending his cloak. These weren't luxuries. They were extensions of his body, as essential as his hands or eyes. The shepherd's knowledge was his true strength, though. He could read the sky like a book, spotting the low, heavy clouds that promised snow. He knew the plants that could heal a sick animal or warm his own body on a freezing night. This wasn't knowledge from scrolls or scholars. It was hard-earned, passed down through generations, whispered by fathers to sons around smoky fires. The shepherd's role went far beyond herding. He was a guardian, not just of sheep or cows, but of his community's future. Chronicles from places like 14th-century Novgorod paint him as an unsung hero, his work critical yet rarely celebrated. His flock provided wool for cloaks, milk for cheese, meat for winter stores, and leather for shoes. A single lost animal could unravel a family's survival, so he watched his herd with a vigilance that never wavered. Wolves prowled the edges of his pastures, their eyes glinting in the dark. Thieves and outlaws, desperate in lean times, saw a lone shepherd as an easy mark. And the land itself was a challenge. Ravines that could swallow a stray sheep, rivers that froze into treacherous paths, storms that struck without warning. Every day was a test, every night a gamble. What made his life so remarkable was his intimacy with the land. He lived in a way that's hard for us to imagine now, tuned to the pulse of the seasons, the habits of his animals, the warnings in the wind. He could sense a predator by the way his flock grew restless, predict a storm by the way the air thickened. In some regions, he was a figure of folklore, his solitary silhouette against the night sky inspiring songs and stories. Villagers whispered that he spoke to spirits, that his whistle could calm the wild or ward off evil. These weren't just tales. They were a way to honor a man who faced the darkness alone, night after night, his life a thread woven into the fabric of his community. Archaeological finds, like the rough woolen cloaks and sturdy staffs uncovered in medieval sites, tell us his gear was simple but deliberate, each piece shaped by necessity. The shepherd's existence was one of solitude and sacrifice. Often young, sometimes barely a boy, he was sent into the fields as a test of endurance, a rite of passage that forged him into a man. In some families, shepherding was a legacy, a craft handed down through generations, each teaching the next how to survive the wild. The loneliness could be crushing, hours, sometimes days, spent with only the bleating of sheep or the howl of the wind for company. Yet it was this solitude that honed his resilience, his ability to stay calm when fear crept in, to keep moving when his body begged for rest. His life wasn't glamorous, but it was profound, a quiet act of defiance against a world that offered no mercy. Now, imagine the world transforming around him as winter descends. The fields turn to ice, the wind grows teeth, and the nights stretch longer, darker, colder. Winter wasn't just a season for the shepherd. It was a crucible, a time when every skill, every scrap of knowledge, was put to the test. The cold could kill in hours, turning breath to vapor and fingers to ice. Temperatures in northern Europe could plummet to -20 degrees Celsius or lower, with blizzards that buried paths and winds that tore through even the thickest cloak. For the shepherd, there was no respite. His flock still needed grazing, still needed protection, and he was their only defense against the elements and the predators that grew bolder in the lean months. The cold was a silent enemy, creeping into his bones, sapping his strength with every step. Hypothermia was a constant threat, especially if his clothes got wet or the wind found a gap in his layers. Frostbite could claim fingers, toes, or the tip of his nose, leaving scars that told of winters endured. Historical records, like medical treatises from the time, describe shepherds found frozen in the fields, their bodies a testament to the cold's brutality. Yet the shepherd didn't just endure, he adapted. He learned to find shelter in the unlikeliest places. A ravine shielded from the wind, a dense thicket where snow didn't pile as high, a cluster of rocks that held a fraction of warmth. When nature offered no refuge, he built his own, using branches, sod, or even snow to create a barrier against the night. Fire was his lifeline, a fragile thread of warmth in a world of ice. Starting a fire in a snowstorm was a skill honed over years, using dry bark, resin-soaked twigs, or a precious firebrand carried in a greased pouch against his chest. He'd nurse the flame with care, knowing a single gust could snuff it out. The fire wasn't just for warmth, it kept wolves at bay, their eyes glinting just beyond the light's reach. He'd position it so the wind carried the smoke away, preserving his fuel and keeping his shelter breathable. Chronicles from 15th century Scandinavia describe shepherds building fires under fir trees, the branches trapping heat like a natural roof. He'd sit as close as he dared, his body curled to conserve warmth, his staff within reach in case danger stirred. Food was a constant struggle in winter. The shepherd carried what he could in a small sack: dried bread, turnips, maybe a scrap of lard or salted meat. These weren't meals to enjoy, they were fuel to keep his body moving. If he could make a fire, he'd boil water with herbs gathered in warmer months, mint, St. John's wort, nettle, creating infusions that warmed his core and fought off illness. In desperate times, he'd resort to boiling pine needles to ward off scurvy or chewing tree bark mixed with bran. Historical sources mention shepherds eating snow-melted gruel or thawing frozen porridge by the fire, every bite a calculated effort to survive. His flock needed constant attention, too, huddling together for warmth, their survival as critical as his own. The mental toll was as heavy as the physical. The silence of a winter night, broken only by the crackle of the fire or a wolf's distant howl, could gnaw at the mind. Loneliness was a companion as real as his sheep, and fear was never far away. Yet the shepherd learned to master it, to take short naps by the fire, waking every few minutes to stoke the flames or check his flock. He'd move constantly, rubbing his hands, stamping his feet, keeping his blood from stagnating. Chronicles from northern Russia tell of shepherds who survived by sheer willpower, refusing to let the cold claim them. Their resilience was born of necessity, a refusal to give in to despair, a commitment to the animals and the community that depended on them. The shepherd's ability to read his environment was his greatest weapon. He could sense a storm in the weight of the air, spot a predator by the way his flock shifted. He knew which plants could sustain him, which rocks held heat longest. This wasn't just skill. It was a partnership with the land, a deep understanding that let him navigate without maps or tools. His story is one of survival but also of connection, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, human ingenuity can find a way. And as the winter nights grew darker, his clothing and tools became his armor, his first line of defense against the cold's relentless assault. The shepherd's clothing was his shield, a patchwork of necessity that stood between him and the freezing night. Picture him wrapped in layers of rough, hand-woven fabric, each piece chosen not for comfort but for survival. His base layer was a linen or canvas shirt, often patched and worn thin, but worn in multiple layers to trap heat. Over this went a zypon, a thick woolen tunic woven from the wool of his own flock. This garment was his mainstay, heavy and dense, sometimes smeared with grease or resin to repel snow and rain. In the deepest winter, he'd add a sheepskin cloak, the fur turned inward to cradle his body's warmth. These cloaks were more than clothing. They were heirlooms, passed down through generations. Each tear and patch a story of winters survived. His footwear was a constant battleground. Leather boots, or sometimes just strips of hide, were stuffed with dry grass, moss, or wool scraps to insulate against the frozen ground. Wet feet could mean frostbite, so he'd wrap them in cloth or line them with birch bark for extra protection. His hands were shielded by rough mittens of leather or thick cloth, sometimes just fur scraps tied with straps. His head was covered by a woolen hat or a sheepskin hood, often coated with soot and grease to block the wind. These hoods, called clobucus in some regions, could cover his neck and face, leaving only his eyes to face the storm. Every piece was utilitarian, darkened by dirt and smoke, but each had a purpose, verified by years of trial and error. His tools were just as practical. A belt pouch or small sack held his essentials: dried bread, herbs, a flint for fire, a spare strip of cloth for mending or wrapping wounds. His staff was a multi-tool, a guide for his flock, a weapon against predators, a support for weary legs. His knife, with its curved blade, was used for everything from cutting firewood to shearing wool for repairs. Archaeological finds from sites like Novgorod confirm the simplicity of his gear: coarse woolen garments, leather scraps, iron blades, all bearing the marks of a life spent in the wild. He mended his clothes himself, stitching patches with flax thread or shearing wool from his sheep to plug holes. To lose a cloak was to lose a piece of his survival, a betrayal of the animals who provided it. The shepherd's resourcefulness shone in how he used his environment. When his cloak wasn't enough, he'd stuff dry leaves or straw under his shirt for insulation. When his boots failed, he'd wrap his feet in bark. When the wind was too fierce, he'd crouch behind his flock, their bodies a living shield. Every choice was deliberate, every action a step toward survival. His clothing wasn't made in workshops or markets. It was born from the land, from the animals he guarded, from the hands of those who taught him. In some regions, shepherds were known to carry small knives with curved blades, used not just for practical tasks but for carving protective symbols into their staffs, a blend of utility and superstition. This ingenuity extended to every aspect of his life, but nowhere was it more critical than in the shelters he built to survive the night. As the wind howled and the snow piled higher, the shepherd's ability to carve out a refuge from the wilderness was what kept him alive, a testament to his skill and his unbreakable will. The night is closing in, and the shepherd stands alone in a frozen landscape, his breath a fleeting cloud in the darkness. Finding shelter was his lifeline, a task as urgent as breathing. Without a permanent home, he relied on the land itself, transforming branches, stones, and snow into a fragile defense against the cold. In open pastures, he'd build a simple tent, weaving branches with sod or his own cloak to block the wind. In forests, he sought natural refuges: fallen trees, rock overhangs, dense thickets where the snow was thinner. If he was lucky, he'd find a ravine or a southern slope, where the wind's bite was softer and the ground held a whisper of warmth. These weren't cozy retreats. They were crude, damp, and smoky, but they were enough to keep death at bay. Building a shelter was a craft, honed by years of facing the elements. He'd choose his spot with care, avoiding wind tunnels, seeking a source of fuel like dry wood or bark. If he stayed in one place for days, he might dig a shallow pit, cover it with poles and spruce boughs, and weigh it down with stones to hold against the storm. Historical records from northeastern Russia describe shepherds crafting half-huts, their walls pressed with turf to trap heat. A small hole in the roof let smoke escape, because fire was the heart of every shelter. Starting a fire in a snowstorm was an art. Dry bark, resin-soaked twigs, a firebrand kept dry in a greased pouch. He'd nurse the flame with patience, knowing a single mistake could leave him in darkness. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was protection. Wolves, hungry and bold in winter, would circle just beyond the light, their howls a reminder of the dangers lurking in the night. The shepherd positioned his fire so the wind carried the smoke away, preserving his fuel and keeping his shelter breathable. He'd stay awake, feeding the fire with brushwood, his staff or knife always within reach. Chronicles from the 15th century describe shepherds in Scandinavia building fires under fir trees, the branches trapping heat like a natural canopy. The ground inside his shelter was another challenge. Frozen earth could steal his body's warmth, so he'd line it with dry leaves, hay, or wool scraps. In desperate moments, he'd let his dogs or a lamb sleep beside him, their body heat a precious gift. Some nights, he'd join other shepherds in collective camps, sharing warmth and watch duties. These herds, as some texts called them, were fortified with stone walls or log fences, a small fortress against the night. A shared fire burned brighter, and the presence of others eased the crushing solitude. On well-traveled routes, he might return to known campsites, where generations of shepherds had built crude huts of turf and stone. These were waypoints in a frozen world, offering a moment's reprieve. But even in these shelters, the cold was relentless. His clothes would frost over, his breath would freeze in his beard, and only his will kept him moving. The shepherd's shelter was a reflection of his life. Simple, deliberate, born of necessity. Every branch, every stone, every scrap of cloth was chosen with purpose, a small act of defiance against the winter's wrath. His ability to create a refuge from nothing was a testament to his ingenuity, a skill that carried him through the darkest nights and into the dawn. And what sustained him through those nights, beyond shelter and fire, was the food he carried and the rituals that gave him strength. The shepherd's diet was sparse but strategic, his meals a matter of survival, not taste. In his small sack he kept dried bread, turnips, maybe a piece of lard or salted meat, rations that could last through days of cold. If he could make a fire, he'd boil water with herbs gathered in warmer months. Mint, St. John's wort, nettle. These infusions warmed his body and fought off illness, a trick learned from generations before him. In lean times, he'd boil pine needles to prevent scurvy or chew tree bark mixed with bran. Every bite a calculated effort to keep going. On rare nights, he might roast a small animal, a bird caught in a trap, or a hedgehog cooked on coals. Historical sources mention shepherds using charred iron bowls or wooden mugs to boil gruel or soften stale bread. Fermented drinks like kvass or honey-based brews were a rare treat, stored in clay jugs wrapped in wool to keep from freezing. A sip could chase the cold from his chest, but he knew not to overindulge. Drunkenness in the cold was a death sentence. He'd add pepper, dried rowan berries, or horseradish to his broth, drinking it slowly to savor the warmth. Salt and onions were his constants, salt to preserve meat, onions to ward off colds, and, in folklore, to keep evil at bay. The shepherd's rituals went beyond food. Faith and superstition were as much a part of his survival as his cloak or fire. He carried a wooden cross or a consecrated image, whispering prayers before sleep, lines from the Lord's Prayer or pleas for protection. In the darkest nights, between Christmas and Epiphany, he'd burn St. John's wort or juniper, believing the smoke drove off spirits. Some shepherds carved protective symbols on their staffs or tied red threads around their sheep, charms against the evil eye. Chronicles from 14th century Russia describe shepherds sticking willow twigs in the ground or laying them crosswise at their shelter's entrance, believing they absorbed frost or illness. These acts weren't just superstition. They were a way to find strength, to feel connected to something greater in the face of endless cold. The shepherd's life was a balance of practicality and belief, of hard-won skills and quiet faith. His story is filled with moments of incredible resilience. Tales like that of Yakov, recorded in Novgorod Chronicles, who survived 3 days in a snowdrift with his dogs, keeping a fire alive with the last of his brushwood. Or the shepherd girl from Scandinavia, taught by her mother to make a warming infusion of calamus and mead, saving her life in -30 degrees Celsius cold. These weren't just stories. They were lessons, passed down through generations, teaching how to endure when everything seemed lost. What can this shepherd teach us today? His life was a masterclass in survival, a reminder that strength lies not in fighting nature but in working with it. He didn't conquer the cold. He adapted to it, using every scrap of knowledge to stay alive. His ability to build a fire, find shelter, or read the signs of a coming storm was honed by necessity. But it's a wisdom that still resonates. Modern survivalists study these same techniques: how to start a fire without matches, how to insulate with moss, how to stay calm when fear creeps in. The shepherd's mindset, his refusal to panic, his focus on the next step, is a guide for any challenge, whether in the wilderness or in our daily lives. His connection to the land was profound. He didn't see himself as separate from the world but as part of it, reading its signs, respecting its power. Today, when technology often distances us from nature, his example calls us to pay attention, to notice the clouds, the wind, the way animals move. His resilience was mental as much as physical. Loneliness, fear, exhaustion. They were as real as the cold, but he faced them with a clarity that kept him alive. He sang to ward off despair, prayed to find focus, moved to keep his body from freezing. This inner discipline is a lesson for us all. In crisis, stay steady, break the problem into steps, and keep going. The shepherd's life was also about duty. He endured for his flock, for his village, for the people who depended on him. His quiet sacrifice reminds us that our struggles often have a larger purpose, whether for family, community, or a cause we believe in. His legacy isn't just in the skills he passed down but in the spirit he embodied. A refusal to give up, a commitment to protect what mattered, a partnership with the world around him. As we leave the shepherd's frozen fields, his story lingers as a testament to human endurance. He didn't write chronicles or sing his own praises, but every winter dawn he met, every night he survived, was a victory. His life was a silent chronicle of courage, a map for navigating hardship with nothing but your wits and your will. If his story has stirred something in you, if you're inspired by the resilience of those who faced the cold with nothing but their hands and their heart, then join us at Boring History. Subscribe, hit that bell, and drop a comment below. Tell us what you think of the shepherd's tale, or what forgotten story you'd like us to explore next. Together, we'll keep uncovering the past, finding strength in its lessons, and proving that history is anything but boring. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and keep walking through the snow.